Catalina Island looks peaceful from a distance. A strip of emerald water, quiet hills, sunlight drifting across the shore. But beneath this paradise lies one of the most unsettling archaeological stories in California. A story most people have never heard, and a story others wish would stay buried. For decades, tourists walk these beaches without knowing that just below their feet, there once existed a private museum built from human bones. Window frames lined with skeletal arms, doorways edged with femurs, skulls displayed like trophies. The man behind it called himself an archaeologist. History remembers him differently. His name was Ralph Glidden. Between 1919 and 1928, he dug through hundreds of burial sites belonging to the island's ancient Tongva people, collecting bones, selling artifacts, and telling stories that shocked anyone who listened. But none of his claims were more disturbing than the one he guarded most fiercely. Glidden insisted he had found something impossible, a body unlike any other ever discovered on the island. A skeleton he measured at nearly 8 feet tall, the Catalina Island giant. Most researchers dismissed him. Others questioned his motives. And soon, records vanished, bones were reburied, and the truth dissolved into rumor. But the question remains, if Glidden invented everything, why were so many pieces of his story quietly erased? And if he was telling the truth, why does no one want to talk about what he found? Today, we return to Catalina. Not for the beaches, but for the mystery that refuses to stay underground. For thousands of years, long before tourists stepped onto Catalina's shores, this island had another name. Pimu, home of the Tongva people, a civilization older than the Roman Empire, older than the great kingdoms of Europe, thriving here in the Pacific long before any outsider arrived. They built villages along these cliffs and coves. They carved the island's soft gray soapstone into bowls, vessels, ceremonial objects, then sailed them across the coast in wooden plank canoes, so advanced that early explorers couldn't understand how they were made. These weren't primitive drifters living on the edges of the world. They were navigators, engineers, artists, story keepers. And Pimu was their heart. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of their world everywhere, from the wide village sites near Avalon in Isthmus to the ritual spaces hidden deep inside Torquay Cave, its walls marked with red and black pictographs that still glow faintly in torchlight. Across the island are layers of cooking pits, shell middens, tools, beads, fish hooks, and the remains of ceremonies that once shaped the rhythms of Tongva life. For more than 7,000 years, this community lived, traded, celebrated, mourned, and buried their dead in these soils, generation after generation. A lineage stretching back through time, long before California had a name. And through all that history, through every excavation, every study, every bone cataloged, scientists found no evidence of a separate race of giants. Heights varied, as humans do. Some tall, some short, all within the range of normal human stature. That is the world the Tongva left behind. Rich, complex, human. But then, in the early 1900s, everything changed. A man with a shovel, a camera, and a hunger for discovery landed on Catalina Island. He wasn't Tongva. He wasn't a trained archaeologist, but he arrived with a certainty that the island's past held secrets no one else had dared to imagine. And as he began tearing open ancient burial sites, sifting through the dead for artifacts to sell, he made a claim so shocking that it would overshadow the entire history of Pimu. A claim that would drown out the voices of the Tongva themselves. A claim that would transform this island from a peaceful archaeological landscape into the center of one of America's most enduring, forbidden mysteries. There were giants, he said. Tall, powerful beings whose bones he held in his hands. Scientists dismissed him. Historians criticized him. But Glidden didn't back down. He doubled his efforts, and the deeper he dug, the stranger his stories became. The tragedy is this: once his shovel touched the soil, the line between true Tongva history and sensational myth began to blur. A blur we are still trying to untangle today. Because the next discovery he claimed to make would change everything. Ralph Glidden arrived on Catalina with a single mission: to uncover the island's past, no matter what he had to break to reach it. He called himself an archaeologist, but what he built looked nothing like a place of science. It looked like a shrine to the dead. Between 1919 and 1928, Glidden tore open burial after burial, more than 800 graves, scattered across the cliffs, coves, and hilltops of Catalina. He pried beads from rib cages, lifted skulls from ancient resting places, and stacked bones into crates that would fill his private museum. Not a museum of knowledge, a museum of spectacle. Visitors describe window frames lined with human femurs, support beams lashed together with arm bones, and shelves crowded with skulls, each displayed like a trophy he believed he had earned. The scientific community recoiled. To them, Glidden wasn't a researcher. He was a grave robber, a showman, a man who cared more about tickets sold than truths preserved. But Glidden didn't see himself that way. He believed the island had chosen him, that he was the only one willing to tell the story hidden beneath its soil. And so he dug deeper, far past the village sites, past the ceremonial grounds, into the untouched layers where the Tongva had buried their dead for thousands of years. And that's when his stories changed. The careful notes became dramatic, the measurements inconsistent, the claims extraordinary. He wrote of strange burial patterns, of children laid in clusters, of high-status individuals sealed inside stone vessels, and of skeletons that, according to him, did not match any known human population. Whispers spread across the mainland. A man on Catalina had found something impossible, and he was putting it on display. But what exactly did Glidden claim to see down there? What discovery pushed him from eccentric digger to the center of California's most forbidden legend? That answer, the one he guarded more fiercely than any artifact, was a single skeleton he insisted was far too large to belong to an ordinary human being. And that discovery is where the mystery truly begins. Glidden claimed the moment came late in his excavations, after weeks of digging through layered soil, weeks of unearthing ordinary burials, until one chamber felt different. He described it as a stone-lined vault, sealed tighter than any grave he had opened before. Inside, he said, was a high-status woman placed carefully within a massive soapstone vessel, a princess, in his words. But what lay beneath her is what fueled a century of whisper and speculation. Glidden wrote that the next layer revealed 64 small skeletons arranged in a compact cluster, as if they were placed there deliberately, a long-forgotten ritual sealed in silence. And below them, in the deepest pocket of the chamber, he claimed to find the body that changed everything. A skeleton he measured at 7 feet 8 inches tall, far beyond the height of the Tongva, far beyond the normal limits of human variation. He photographed it, though the surviving images are grainy, distorted, missing scale bars and context. Some look stretched by angle, others blurred by time. Skeptics argue the bones were misplaced, mismeasured, or misrepresented. Anthropologists insist no peer-reviewed evidence has ever confirmed a human of that size from Catalina. But Glidden never backed down. To him, the giant was proof that Catalina had once held a population no one remembered, a people erased long before written history touched the island's shores. He spoke of elongated skulls, robust limbs, and proportions he insisted were unlike any he'd ever seen. And he guarded the story fiercely, even as scientists rejected him, and museums refused to acknowledge his claims. What disturbed later researchers most wasn't just what Glidden said he found, but what happened next. Records vanished, artifacts scattered, human remains quietly reburied, leaving behind a single, unresolved truth. If Glidden was lying, why erase the evidence? And if he wasn't, then Catalina Island may have once held a chapter of human history that we are no longer allowed to examine. After Glidden announced his discovery, the story refused to stay on Catalina Island. It drifted across California, then across the entire country, transforming from an archaeological footnote into a legend people whispered about in libraries, bars, and back rooms. Because Glidden's giant wasn't just tall. According to him, it belonged to a different kind of people, a population erased so completely that only fragments of their bones remained beneath the soil. And soon, the legends multiplied. Some claimed Catalina had once been home to fair-haired, light-skinned giants, standing 7 to 9 feet tall, ruling the Channel Islands long before the Tongva arrived. Others reached even further, linking Glidden's find to biblical Nephilim, the so-called offspring of angels and humans, banished to remote corners of the world. A few writers went darker still. They said the giants guarded something beneath the island, a cavern system, a hidden chamber, a gateway to a world that ancient myths call the realm below. There was no evidence, no validated measurements, no peer-reviewed reports. But the more the scientific community rejected these claims, the more the legends grew, fueled by a single, uncomfortable truth. Glidden had destroyed much of the original archaeological context, leaving gaps large enough for entire mythologies to slip through. And every gap raised another question. Why did Glidden insist that some skulls looked elongated? Why did he describe limb proportions that didn't match modern humans? Why were his notes theatrical, yet strangely specific? Most scholars dismissed it all as exaggeration, the fantasies of a man desperate to be remembered. But others wondered, if Glidden was fabricating everything, why did his stories align so closely with older Channel Islands legends of the Tall Ones? Legends that existed long before he ever set foot on Catalina. Whether coincidence or something more, the myth had taken root. A forbidden chapter of California's past, half truth and half shadow, growing in the silence left behind. And soon, events on the island would push that silence even deeper. In the years that followed Glidden's excavations, a quiet shift began on Catalina Island. Museums stopped displaying his findings. Researchers distanced themselves from his claims. And the bones he once paraded as evidence, the very remains at the center of the controversy, slowly disappeared from public view. Some were moved into storage. Others were transferred between institutions. Many were stripped of their original labels, their context mixed or lost. And then the silence grew deeper. By the 2000s, most of the human remains Glidden had collected were no longer available for study. And in 2016, more than 2,200 individuals, including many from Glidden's excavations, were formally reburied in private Tongva ceremonies. It was an act of respect, a long overdue return of ancestors to their rightful place. But scientifically, it meant something else. It meant the physical evidence, the bones Glidden measured, the skulls he described, the remains he claimed were unlike any human he had ever seen, were now beyond examination forever. No DNA tests, no modern measurements, no independent verification, just fragments of story, fragments of photographs, fragments of a man's questionable notes. And yet, those fragments were enough to ensure the mystery would never truly fade. Because every missing artifact became a question mark. Every burial Glidden disturbed became a gap no researcher could ever fill. And as scholars tried to reconstruct Tongva history, they ran into a wall Glidden himself had built. A century-old tangle of damaged context, lost remains, and claims impossible to prove or disprove. It left behind a paradox that still unsettles historians today. If Glidden was wrong, we may never have the evidence to show it. But if he was right, we may have buried the proof before we had the tools to understand it. And that uncertainty is the shadow Catalina Island still carries. For more than a century, Catalina Island has carried two histories, one written in stone, shell, and memory, the true story of the Tongva people who lived, traveled, and dreamed across these shores for thousands of years. And the other, a shadow story. A story born from broken graves, missing records, and the words of one man who dug too deep into a past he barely understood. Maybe Glidden exaggerated. Maybe he mismeasured. Maybe he created a legend because the truth wasn't dramatic enough for the museum he wanted to build. But there is a harder possibility, one that lingers over Catalina like a fog that never fully lifts. What if some part of his story was real? What if evidence once existed and vanished before anyone could study it? Glidden's giants may be myth. They may be misunderstanding. Or they may be something far more complicated. A fragment of history erased not by conspiracy, but by time, chaos, and the consequences of careless excavation. Today, the island is quiet. The beaches are calm. The past sleeps again beneath the soil. But a question remains, a question that refuses to stay buried. How many other mysteries were lost before we had the tools to recognize them? And that question leads us somewhere far from the ocean. To a desert where the ground split open one night and a fire burst from the earth with a roar so bright, so violent, that people believed they had opened a doorway into the underworld. A fire that should have died within hours, yet it kept burning and burning and burning until the desert itself became a beacon in the darkness. If Catalina showed us how history can disappear, this next place shows us what happens when the earth refuses to let its secrets go. Next episode, Earth's hidden mysteries. They lit a fire in the desert, and it never went out.